Hi, I'm Phil Harbottle, and this is my 40th video about British science fiction. Now, as far as I can remember, from the age of 5 years old, I've always been fascinated by the concepts of interplanetary space travel and possible alien life forms. Of course, such ideas are the very stuff of science fiction, but at that age I had no idea that there was such a genre as science fiction, and I had no idea of its existence in book and magazine form. But all that was to change within a few years. Now then, as I detailed in my earlier videos, like many children born during the war, my imagination was first stimulated into these channels by an exposure to comics. In immediate post-war Britain, there were many British reprints of American superhero comics such as Captain Marvel, and it was by reading them that I first became infected with the science fiction, with the science fiction virus. Here we see one of the Captain Marvel space stories, which I read at the age of 5. Captain Marvel and the Space Dragon. The script was by science fiction writer Otto Binder, who switched from writing for the pulps to writing for the comic books in about 1940. So there you see it. So that's what first captivated me. It was reinforced by my attendances with my friends at the children's Saturday morning cinema matinees to watch the reruns of such old American fantasy serials as Captain Marvel, you see here, old Republic Films serial, Captain Marvel, black and white of course in those days. Exciting stuff for the matinee. That was Captain Marvel. And of course the other famous serial, originally in the 1930s, which we saw in 1950, was Flash Gordon. You'll see Flash Gordon and Dale Arden and Ming the Merciless and so on and so forth. Now that infection became deepened by late 1950 because, bear with me, next, you want to see. The advent of the new weekly Eagle comic featuring the famous Frank Hampson script Dan Dare was crucial for the development of science fiction in Britain. It also, you can see here, the brilliance of the Dan Dare, and particularly the space suits with their gauntlets, pepper pot helmets with a transparent face visor. See, Adventures on Venus, and running at the same time as these exciting Dan Dare adventures in Eagle was another famous British comic strip, Garth, in the Daily Mirror. And that was running concurrently with the Dan Dare story on Venus, was a wonderful story called Journey to Jason in the Daily Mirror. And there we see Garth's first interplanetary adventure. These are the daily strips clipped out and collected. Garth's first trip into space. that. So Garth and Dan Dare were running concurrently, and they're both featuring space adventures. So along with my best friend Ian Dick, I became an avid follower of both Garth and Dan Dare. But it was then, in the autumn of 1950, Ian and I became intrigued by a book display in a high street newsagent's window. We were electrified to see the colourful cover of a boys' annual entitled Flights into the Future, emblazoned in crimson on a bright blue starry background. It depicted 3 men in spacesuits setting up their scientific experiments after disembarking from the spaceship. Particularly intriguing was the fact that the spacesuits very closely resembled those of Frank Hansen's. Pepper pot metal helmets with a transparent face visor, belted thick overalls, tucked into boots, just like Dan Dare, and the spacemen were wearing gauntlets. We gazed longingly at that book, noses pressed against the window. What wonderful adventures lay beneath its covers. What was it all about? But alas, I was only 9 years old and had no money. Ian was equally impecunious. We neither of us could buy the book. In those days of post-war austerity, the temerity of asking my working-class father to buy the book for me didn't even occur, not for a moment. I gazed longingly at that book every time I passed the shop, several times a week. Then one day, shortly before Christmas, it disappeared from view. No doubt it was destined for some lucky boy, but I knew it wouldn't be me. Imagine my surprise then when I visited my friend on Boxing Day and learned that Ian, who was a year older than me, had asked his father to buy the book for him, but he'd only received a non-committal grunt, so he, like me, had given up on ever seeing it. So he'd been surprised and delighted to discover it amongst his presents on Christmas morning. Ian and I regularly swapped or loaned our comics, endlessly discussing the stories. So after a few days, Ian kindly loaned me his copy of the book, so I could at least read it. Looking back now in hindsight, as I examine my own copy of the book, which I only obtained in a second-hand bookshop some 20 years later, I can recall the vivid, even profound effect that it had on my imagination in 1950. I devoured this book, and my belief in the practicality and inevitability of interplanetary space travel, which was considered an impossible fantasy by most people in 1950, became confirmed for life as a matter of faith. Flight into the Future was a mixture of non-fiction articles and science fiction stories. The book was undated, but my copy had been inscribed by its proud first owner, J.B. Harrison, Enderby, Christmas 1948. I suspect it was likely kept in print for several years, perhaps reprinted each Christmas, since some recent listings on books and eBay have recorded it as 1952 or 1955, which could only be based on similar inscriptions, and with red and green spines. The spine of my book was blue, so there were obviously different editions. Now, the articles in the book. Let's have a look at the contents page. There were articles about space travel to the moon and the planets Mars and Venus, and both fiction and non-fiction sections were profusely illustrated in black and white by an uncredited James McConnell, who also painted the splendid wraparound cover picture. It's a wraparound, painted by James McConnell. See his signature. From this piece. McConnell did the cover, but the interior, there were 8 full colour plates, and they were signed by an artist called Nat Long. And there's his frontispiece. You can see the spacemen were closely modelled on McConnell's on the cover, so there's a nice consistency there. The versatile Nat Long was a prolific illustrator in the 1930s, 1940s and early 50s. He specialised in action scenes. Now, Nat Long should not be confused with his artist contemporary, Nat Brand. I myself was recently guilty of this because of the shared Christian name Nat, a silly error for which I apologise. It should also be noted that a written version of this video was recently published in the summer edition of the magazine Spaceship Away, number 57. Unfortunately, in rushing my copy to the editor in response to his SOS for an article, I had an octogenarian senior moment and referred to artist Nat Long as Nat Brand. I apologise to its editor, Des Shaw, and his readers. I hope, too, that this will not be regarded as a crucial defect. There is so much to enjoy in his fine magazine. Right, now, back to this video. Long's many paperback covers. Let's see a couple of them here. You see his signature, Nat Long. Nat Long's many paperback covers ran the gamut from crime thrillers, lurid romances and westerns, a couple of which we see here. His human figures were somewhat bland and wooden, and his paperback covers could best be described as workmanlike. But this likely reflected their speedy execution for the lower paying, very cheap austerity paperback markets, such as the Curtis Warren line, which we'll see here. His best work was reserved for the higher paying juvenile hardcover market. He did fine full colour illustrations for several annual type publishers, such as the Thames Publishing Company, most notably the illustrated edition of Tom Brown's School Days and the present book, Flight into the Future. Many of the plates were quite striking, especially those for the Jules Verne and Conan Doyle stories. See here. Jules Verne plate by Nat Long. These are just 2 of the 8 plates, which we'll look at later. And that's for the Conan Doyle. There you see the Nat Long signature. That's him, Nat Long. Okay. When I first read this book, I was particularly impressed by the non-fiction. The book opens with a long, very well written article, Through Space to the Moon, by the noted inventor and scientific commentator Archibald M. Lowe, 1888-1956. Now, his publishers always styled him as Professor A.M. Lowe. You can see here in this 1946 Pendulum Press booklet, 6 Scientific Years, and his last book, Satellite in Space, a 1956 science fiction novel from Herbert Jenkins. Now, Lowe had been an associate professor of physics at the Royal Ordnance College between 1919 and 1922. And during the war, he was an officer commanding the Royal Flying Corps experimental works and was credited with many scientific inventions, including the first robot plane. Now, Lowe's article was couched as questions and answers and covered the utilising of rockets for space travel and how spacecraft would eventually land on the moon and the inner planets. Superb article by A.M. Lowe. there were 4 interlinked articles by an aeronautical journalist called Harry Harper. Can Man Reach the Moon? By Spaceship to the Moon, The First Men on the Moon, and The Riddles of Mars and Venus, and the 5th final piece, Peeps into the Speed Age. Harper, who lived 1880 to 1960, had followed in his father's footsteps by becoming a very successful journalist. The Daily Mail had appointed him as that paper's first ever air correspondent, only 3 years after the Wright brothers made their first pioneering flight. Harper had authored some juvenile science fiction novels pre-war, usually with an aeronautical basis, such as The Invisible Warplane, Blackie 1915. But after the war, he switched to non-fiction, and as an early member of the British Interplanetary Society, his interest in aeronautics had now encompassed space travel, as exemplified in his book Dawn of the Space Age, Samson Low, 1946. His authoritative byline also frequently appeared in numerous post-war magazines and books. And we can see one here. This is the prestigious Collins magazine annual, a real quality publication for adults and children. And here we see one of the many features that Harry Harper wrote about space and rocketry, with facts and forecasts all in the latest scientific progress on rocketry. So Harry Harper was the top authority of the period. And these are very fine articles which really captured my imagination. Flight into the Future's features were very well written and scientifically accurate for the time. Let's see if we can get a cut of where's the first Harry Harper article. Page 46. There we are. The articles were astonishingly prescient in numerous instances. For example, that the first moon rocket would be a 3-stage craft that would be preceded by an unmanned rocket sent around the moon first. Other 1948 predictions by Low included worldwide radio and television, achieved by a network of artificial satellites, some 14 years before Telstar in 1962. This idea had, of course, originally been conceived and published even earlier by Arthur C. Clarke in 1945, at the time when Clarke was the chairman of the British Interplanetary Society. Both Low and Harper would have met Clarke at the BIS meetings, and so were familiar with his speculations. Their articles were undoubtedly based on the numerous published papers by the British Interplanetary Society, which had been formed in 1933. Clarke was its most famous member, and Professor A.M. Low was a founder member of the BIS, serving as the second president from 1936 to 51. The BIS had specialised in how to plan and execute the first journey to the moon, and many of its conclusions and recommendations would actually be used and adopted by NASA decades later. Now, in this book, there were 3 science fiction stories. Already referred to the first one. Jules Verne's Flight to the Moon. The novel was retold as a short story. In this version. Very commendably, in its introduction, it pointed out that its central theme of space travel via an enormous cannon would have killed its inhabitants. But the rest of the book was surprisingly scientifically plausible. Now the second story, which was the Conan Doyle story, this one. There we are. The second story by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was The Horror of the Heights, originally published in 1913, and here reprinted as Jungle of the Air. And we've seen that Long's vivid colour plate, which admirably captured the grim fate that was awaiting any pioneer aviators who reached beyond 40,000 feet, which was, of course, was science fiction in 1913. Destruction by monstrous jellyfish-like creatures inhabiting the upper stratosphere. There was one other story in the book. This one here. Now that one was by a relatively unknown author, A.S. Long, Last Days on Earth. And unfortunately it was quite mediocre and a curiously flat story. It had a brilliant illustration by Nat Long, but it was otherwise a pretty flat story. It dealt with the astronauts' thoughts and machinations before, there they are, before they took off on the first lunar flight. And it was devoid of any real science fiction elements. It barely registered with me. I found the non-fiction the most exciting, particularly the section, The Riddles of Mars and Venus, which we'll look at next. See where it is. There is the Mars and Venus, page 75. Bear with me. There we are. This was the article that really gripped me at the time. Harper's article portrayed the then widely held, alas fictitious, belief that Venus was a much younger world than its sister planet Earth. It was thought to be in the stage our Earth was in something like 1,000 million years ago, with huge reptiles wallowing in steamy swamps. Again, it was admirably captured in Nat Long's splendid colour plate. It was capturing prehistoric monsters, long extinct on Earth, may live on Venus. And if we just look here, there's Frank Hampson's Venus with prehistoric monsters. And reading this convincing article made the Frank Hampson's Venus thoroughly believable. Great stuff. So, it was this interesting book then that cemented my lifelong interest in science fiction. It deserves to be a collector's item, which is why I'm making this video. Now, collectors should note that reasonably priced copies still turn up occasionally on e-books and eBay, but they'll be almost certainly lacking the dust wrapper. But since the dust wrapper was reprinted on the boards, that's scarcely a crucial defect. So let's have a quick look through the other pages. See that one? See that one? I think that's the last one. So there it is, Lights into the Future, the one book that cemented my lifelong interest in science fiction.